Okay.
All right, we're back.
Oh, it's still doing the swirly thing. Is this live or not?
We're not back.
Oh, yeah, we're live. Okay. Good morning, everybody.
Hey, everybody. We're back. And probably can't read this t-shirt as well as the one yesterday. It says, "Death cannot stop your story." I want to give a shout out to Uprising Theater.
Nice.
This is a play that they produced, and it seemed like a very appropriate shirt for today. Mark is doing all kinds of
on
Facebook.
I'm going to let you talk for a little bit while I make sure everything's working fine, because we keep having issues with Facebook Live. But I'm going to share the link to different places to make sure everyone follows it, because this is now live from the CPI page, from the Micah page, I hope, but not through my personal page. So I'm going to share it that way. And then,
okay, sounds good. Yeah. So today we're shifting back towards the socio-political arena, but are going to continue to add in the spiritual perspectives on all of what's going on, and especially because today is kind of a historic anniversary in the world of prophetic spirituality and spirituality as it engages the world of justice, because it's the 40th anniversary of the assassination of Oscar Romero. So obviously he was somebody that was deeply engaged with spirituality for justice, and then was assassinated with our tax dollars. So that's it was a very terrible, sad thing, and it's a good thing to remember and bring into this conversation. How are things going over there in computer land?
there are people starting to track with us. So,
okay.
Yeah. I will, so as Dan was just talking about, it's the 40th anniversary of the assassination of Oscar Romero, and I just wanted to maybe read a few words from his final sermon. And this is the thing, like, I always assume that everybody in the world knows who Oscar Romero is, because in our circles he's a huge deal. But I run into people all the time who...
No, most people do not know who Oscar Romero is.
Who are like, they care about justice, maybe they grew up in the church, they just don't know because there's still a gap. Latin Americans tend to know a lot more about him because he's kind of a patron saint to a lot of people. So I want to give a little bit of background, and this will be a way of maybe framing our conversation. And just, so here's one thing that's interesting. So CPI is known for creating memes, and this is actually a giant version of a meme that we actually have that I kind of created for our page. It doesn't have the CPI logo on it, but so I'm assuming everyone can see that. I'm going to read it. It says, "A church that does not provoke any crisis, preach a gospel that does not unsettle, proclaim a word of God that does not get under anyone's skin, or a word of God that does not touch the real sin of the society in which it is being proclaimed. What kind of gospel is that?" That's from now Saint Oscar Romero.
Well, and so for people who do not know, he was murdered while saying Mass by these death squads who, as I said, were paid for and trained by the Americans, mostly in a place called the School for the Americas,
which is in Georgia.
Yes.
And so America was backing the Civil War. Unfortunately,
in what country?
In El Salvador.
Yes, in El Salvador.
And Archbishop Romero was Archbishop of San Salvador. And this is where it gets kind of weird, because everyone's favorite kindly retired old president, Jimmy Carter, was the president during, leading up to this assassination. So it's not, even if you're a nice, sweethearted old man who builds houses for people, you can still be involved in American exceptionalism. How much you hold them responsible depends on your view of governance, I guess. But the thing that's fascinating about this is Romero, I think, just like Dr. King, knew his days were numbered. And this sermon he gave, it was a sermon in honor of, I think, a journalist who passed away. And the gospel reading that day was John 12, 23 through 26. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. I assure you, unless the grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains infertile. But if it dies, it produces a great yield. Those who love their own life lose it. Those who hate themselves in this world will be preserved for life eternal. Let whoever wants to serve me follow me, and my servant will be where I am. Whoever serves me will be rewarded by my Father. And the sermon is basically a reflection on that. And literally, as he's finishing the sermon, preparing to give the elements of Mass, he was gunned down. Gunned down by a government, a conservative right-wing government that was pursuing the interests of the United States in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah. And so with that as a background, really one of the main topics that we wanted to pursue today, which falls under this larger umbrella of what is being unveiled by the coronavirus pandemic, is this issue of American exceptionalism. Right? So for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, this is this idea that America thinks of itself as exceptional in the world. And this actually, of course, also has Christian roots. So we see that, Christianity is, of course, very multifaceted in its expression. Some very positive things, some very negative things. And this notion of America as being the light to the world, there's this image of the city on the hill that comes out of the Bible. Being this exceptional place is something that is very much a part of the white American ethos, and and we see this very much at play right now with the pandemic and with what's going on. Particularly around the issue of what to do and how to respond to the pandemic.
Yeah. I mean, there's layers to this idea of exceptionalism. Partly it can mean that we're just different than other countries. And that's kind of maybe some of the earlier usage, but that kind of morphed into this idea that the United States has a unique role in the world, has a unique mission. And so that's usually wrapped up in our understanding that we live to spread democracy, that's not how we engage in things in the world. That's just usually the screen cover things. And then that turns into this idea of American superiority, that anything we do is somehow better just by virtue of the fact that America's doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And so this turns into this kind of massive national hubris.
Yeah, and so some of the, those of you who are following along, and I think there's a little bit of a lag in terms of people who, because we've been following off of my personal page, and I don't know how many people are actually following along here on the CPI and Micah pages. But the way it's kind of playing out now is even just the way we get information. We're pretty much the only country in the world where we think just knowing about what's happening in our own country is sufficient, right? I remember when I was 19 and I was dating this young woman from Canada, and she asked me, she knew all about American politics, and then she asked me, well, do you know anything about Canada? And I laughed. I was conservative at the time. I said, why would I have to know anything about what's going on in Canada?
Right.
But I didn't know a single thing at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how most Americans are. We don't know. And so that actually adds a double layer. Not only do we assume that we're doing a good enough job at things,
mm-hmm.
but we have no idea how crappy we are at stuff most of the time.
Right.
And when liberals, I'm using the way that the conservative media, when liberals talk about, maybe we should have healthcare like Scandinavia, it usually actually, people don't get this, it viscerally upsets conservative people because it's just some sort of, what that says isn't we can learn from other countries. It's somehow an indictment that you're challenging the core mission of what it means to be American.
Well, but it doesn't just upset conservatives, right? True. Recently, when people were saying that about Denmark, who was the person that came out, so this is a quiz, who was the person that came out and said, well, we are not Denmark?
I don't know.
It was Hillary Clinton.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, it wasn't Rush Limbaugh, it was Hillary Clinton, just dismissed it. So, well, we're not Denmark, so we can't have health care for all.
Yeah.
This is a very, very deep rooted thing in, and again, particularly in white culture in America. And, one of the biggest ways that that's getting played out with coronavirus is what is the one country that we are hearing the most about as this is going on, right? It's Italy, because that's the country where things, are going badly and they're having a hard time. And so we keep hearing this thing, well, we don't want to be Italy. We don't want to be Italy. We're not hearing hardly anything about the countries that have actually figured out how to deal with this well.
Especially the ones that most challenge our sense of rightness. So we're not hearing about Cuba,
right,
or Venezuela,
right,
and very little. The only thing we hear about China is conspiratorial stuff. So the countries that are most opposed to what we think of as our Pax Americana, the peace we offer the world, we're not willing to learn anything.
Yeah, and so it's very interesting, again, for those of you who are not aware of this. There are three countries that, yes, are smaller than us population-wise, but actually have far more population density than we do. So South Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore, all of which are dealing with this virus in a very different way than we are, and are far more successful, have been far more successful than us. And so their approach has been this approach of massive contact testing and then isolation of literally geographic areas where the virus has appeared. And the reality is that those three countries have largely not shut down their economies and their activities. They've been able to provide masks to millions and millions of people. And the number of cases that they've had and the spread and increase of cases that they've had have been minuscule. So they're actually doing a great job. And the reality is that, and if you've been listening to all of the various press conferences and things, is that not only are these countries never mentioned, but their approach is never mentioned. And we actually keep saying we are not going to do the certain things that they have done that have proved to be successful. Because what this would require is for us to admit that we're doing a very mediocre job with this, and that somebody else has a better idea, right? And for us to admit that as Americans, is, as Mark's mentioning, it's this viscerally uncomfortable thing.
I just have a question, and before I ask you this, Dan, if any of you are noticing examples of American exceptionalism, this idea of our uniqueness and greatness and superiority during this time, feel free to share that in the comment section or ask questions, so we can kind of have more of a dialogue while we're doing this. But I'm wondering, why is it, do you think, that maybe you can say a little bit more about why it is you think we're taking the approach we are? Well, what's the underlying bottom line for why the government is pushing?
Well, basically because we've been completely unprepared, right? And so
we have to act like we're somehow not.
And so we've got to do kind of the second best thing. And again, this is another thing in terms of American exceptionalism, right? And we saw this, particularly with our lovely president. It was when this was happening and coming, the idea was this is not going to hurt us.
Yeah.
Right? This is not going to reach our borders. This is, we are just going to defeat this. This is not going to be a big deal. And again, what we could have added as a line after all those comments is because we're America and we're the best country in the world. And so a little virus is not going to hurt us. So then when that became obvious that that wasn't happening, and we were completely caught flat-footed in terms of abilities to test, in terms of equipment, in terms of all these things, we now have had to try this other method, which, again, as we're seeing around the world, is, not the best method.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, like some of the weird twisted logic. And part of it, this ties in what we were talking about yesterday about Trump acting like he can punch the virus in the face. Right. The idea that he's a wartime president and we Americans understand what. struggle is, and we can overcome any obstacle with our can-do spirit and our dreams. Like that kind of mentality. It's almost magical thinking. That
Yeah,
if
it is.
we have enough passion and ardency. But this is someone brought this up in the comments. This is
Yeah, it's great. We're getting a lot of
Kathleen.
nice comments.
Kathleen writes, some of our leaders are trying to say that we should choose supporting the economy over protecting ourselves from the virus. This is a tweet that has been shared around a little bit from Scott McMillan. And this logic has been shared on Fox News and by politicians in Texas right now. This is the tweet from Scott McMillan. The fundamental problem is whether we are going to tank the entire economy to save 2.5% of the population, which is one, generally expensive to maintain, and two, not productive.
Right.
This idea that we're willing to let millions die off, because what's most important here, let's not lose our heads, is our economy, the free market, which undergirds our freedoms.
Well, but again, and we were talking about this just before we got started, is the lack of subtlety in the thinking about this, right? So because we have taken this approach to the virus that is not the best approach, we have put ourselves in this position of thinking that there's only these two choices, right? So save people or tank the economy. Right? Those save people and tank the economy, or get the economy going and kill people. So that's now the American view and mindset. And now we're going to argue about that, and we're going to trash each other about that. And again, what we are not seeing is that there are places that have done both. They have kept the economy going and they are saving people. Mm-hmm. But because of this weird American exceptionalism that, whatever we're doing is the best way and the only way, we actually don't see that there's another option, which would be a better option. I mean, it would be better to do both, right? To have the economy going and save people. That is a better possibility, but we're acting as if it's not a possibility because we can't look outside ourselves.
Well, I mean, there are people that benefit more if we let people die. I think it's part of it. There's an economic incentive to not have these countries you talked about who are still saving their economies have things like national medicine and things that are maybe they don't have full bore libertarian style capitalism.
Right.
Catherine Parent writes, I lived in Norway. We could totally have universal health care, education, housing. My eventual takeaway as to the main reason we couldn't do it in the U.S., because the people who profit most from our current system have convinced us it's impossible, using racism and other toxic ideologies.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's of course the whole other piece to this is that, right. I mean, the reason, and we discussed this some last week, right, that our form of capitalism is this predatory capitalism that does not put people first. And, and a number of my Black friends have been talking about this from day one of hey, look, having people die to prop up our economy is not a new thing. Right? I mean, This is what slavery was. And so in many ways, this is part of the American ethos that, it's perfectly fine to do things that are incredibly unhealthy, toxic, deadly for huge numbers of people in order to make our economy go. And so I think that, when the Lieutenant Governor of Texas gets up there and says this, this is basically part of the karmic framework of America.
Ellen Morey writes, this is a good point, to quote, let people die is rhetoric being used on both sides. The whole let go of some boomers thing. I mean, so this is and I'm assuming there's some tongue-in-cheekness, but it's still disgusting, this idea that hopefully if we get a bunch of old people dying, they'll get out of our way and we can have prosperity in the maybe more of the progressive sense. But
okay, I haven't heard that one.
I've seen this. It's kind of
that's good.
Right? And I think underneath it, there's still this thing I think as Americans, we are more prone to this idea of having some sort of ideal that we struggle towards together that's outside of ourselves. And that kind of sometimes sounds good. But when it gets abstracted, this idea that we are as a people have to have a mission, besides just taking care of each other, right?
Right.
And that this idea that we have to somehow be better, we have to be great, I think is a part of the rationale for why we think there's always acceptable sacrifices. That's
Yeah.
part of the DNA of America.
Yeah.
From the beginning, we've had to justify making sacrifices, sacrificing people in order to achieve something.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like if you think about it, it's a warped logic of, the Oscar Romero quote, this idea of unless a seed falls to the ground and dies, we can bear no fruit. It's like that's the gospel call, but we take it and we externalize it and say, well, people have to sacrifice and die for our freedoms. It's like a twisted
and,
sort of gospel.
and the and the Protestant work ethic is part of that, and as we've talked about before, is that one of the mental health challenges of this lockdown, right, is that so much of our sense of self-worth comes out of what we do. So if I'm not doing something, if I'm not busy, if I'm not productive, right, if I'm not making sacrifices, if I'm not working hard so that God validates me, then I feel bad. And it's like, well, just taking care of each other, that's not worthwhile. It's not productive enough. So then we have to justify all kinds of other weird activity above and beyond that. Whereas in many of these collectivist cultures in the Far East, there is this ethos of actually taking care of our elders, of our family, of our then country. Like that has inherent worth. Right? I mean, that's just a good thing.
It doesn't have to serve some other thing.
No, it doesn't have to serve anything else.
Yeah, and Ellen says, or how about the quote unquote missionaries who went and exposed the tribe in the rainforest? And this ties into it. Like our American exceptionalism, in some ways, is a mutated pathology of the logic of just going to the ends of the earth to make disciples of all men. So, like, if you add that sort of evangelistic impulse with a willingness to use the sword, that's how you get like these religious justification for conquest. Mm-hmm. And that's still, even though we don't always use God talk in America, sometimes we talk about democracy or free markets. That's still kind of the mentality we have is we're spreading a gospel. Mm-hmm. We alone, maybe the UK in a good year, but we alone can spread this gospel by any means necessary. And anyone who stands against it is the enemy, including the people at home who stand against it, which is, again, the if you listen to Rush Limbaugh, it's the liberals, the people who are the liberal brown shirts, is how Rush Limbaugh used to talk about it, who are just as bad and in league with all the Marxist professors and the Islamofascists. Like, they get all of them together as the enemies to this American gospel.
Yeah. Well, and to me, one of the best recent examples of exactly what you're talking about is this commercial for the Navy that it's probably 2 years old at this point, right? And, and the slogan is, and so it's all the pictures of aircraft carriers and warships, tooling around the oceans. And the slogan is a global force for good. Right? Which is exactly this American exceptionalist gospel message, So of course we go all over the world, taking over everybody, saying, shipping lanes are ours, blah, 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 because we're a global force for good. So what's the problem? And so again, it's this incredible hubris. Right? And this is why this is so antithetical to the true spiritual life, right? Because the spiritual life, the basis of the spiritual life is humility. And in many texts and teachings, the spiritual life is seen as a ladder, and the first rung of the ladder is humility, and that you can't even get started on the spiritual life without that rung being in place. And so, American exceptionalism is completely antithetical to this notion of humility. And, but imagine the outcry, right? If, Trump and Pence and all these folks that have been getting up at this press conferences got up and said, hey, you know what? We actually have not been doing a very good job with this. We haven't been doing it great. We've got these other examples of countries around the world that are doing it better, and we are inviting the heads of all of their medical teams to come here and teach us how to do this.
Yes.
Well, I mean, it's unimaginable, really. That would just never happen here in America.
No, and this is how it all ties in with these other forces and what it ultimately serves. So, these offers from the WHO to these test kits, or even receiving test kits from other countries, like, no, we have to find our own path, which then reinforces the bottom line. Because, it was in the news, like, it's amazing how quick the news is happening with this right now. But was it just last week where it was revealed that Trump was basically trying to buy German scientists to create like a proprietary test kits and stuff for America only.
It was for the vaccine.
Yeah,
it was the company that was working on the vaccine. Yeah, Trump wanted to buy it so that only Americans would have the vaccine. Which, if you think about it, is just incredibly morally obscene.
No, and it's this tying together of like this American exceptionalism, just to kind of like break it down practically. It creates this veil over our perception of the world. So even if you're not inclined to think this way, it's actually you have to go and look for news about outside of our society, which is strange. Like it's one of those things we were promised that the internet would make everyone more informed. Mm-hmm. But the way it's set up, these infrastructures create a bubble effect, because that's better for business. All this stuff is better for business. Right? So we're kind of dumber about the rest of the world. We have this built-in assumption that our how we engage the world is as a leader, mm-hmm. whatever the hell that means. And so we don't automatically assume, even under Trump. Again, in my bubble that I'm in, you think everyone assumes that Trump is now reviled and this is going to finally tank him. But the polling says that the last poll they did was over 50%, 55%, I think, of Americans are kind of impressed with how Trump was handling all this. That happens when you have American exceptionalism and the stupefying factor of how we hear our news, and this assumption that we are a leader in the world and that our mission is just and good.
Well, and one of the things you briefly mentioned a few minutes ago, which I think is so key to this, is the conspiracy theory engagement, right? So that when you do hear anything good about another country, it's amazing how quickly people jump on that and say, oh, that must be wrong, right? That's got to be a lie. They've got to be covering it up, right? This idea that they could actually be doing it better than us is totally impossible, right? And so, China must be lying. This country must be lying. That country must be lying. And again, that just reinforces the wall of that bubble. So we've had a lot of comments. We haven't been jumping on there as much. What are a few of the other things?
Yeah, so Stephen writes, don't you think we all engage in exceptionalism? Who has the magic key to objectivity? I don't think we all engage in it. Like, I think Americans and then other former imperial nations tend to think about themselves, but there's other forms of nationalism out there for sure.
Yeah, I think that the ego process, which is maybe what you're referring to there, the ego process is about being fundamentally self-centered, which is a form of exceptionalism. And certainly every tribe does that. But the level and the degree that has formed American consciousness is not present elsewhere. If you go to other countries and talk to other people, they do not have that. And they're very willing. They look all the time at other peoples and other countries, and they appreciate things that other people do. So there is some of that is inherent to humanity, and certainly all the big, huge empires have done that. But no, our culture has this as part of our cultural DNA in a very heightened kind of way.
Even the sense I get is other countries have senses of rivalries or competitors. We don't have rivalries. We have evil empires that are our enemies, right? So that's part of the logic of being a superpower, is that any threat to us isn't some sort of rivalry like you see with other nations. It's that their way of life is an existential threat to ours, and so it is our mission, in some ways, to eradicate them.
Mhm.
Is like this logic, and we now are maybe more progressive in how we eradicate. We're willing to use diplomacy and trade to eradicate people through embargoes, not just killing, unless we have to.
A couple
Colin,
others.
yeah, one more. Colin, in all this, I have constantly had in mind Brueggemann's likening of an empire in decline to a terminal patient who refuses treatment. I don't want to know what I have.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, denial is definitely a big part of it, for sure. Yeah.
It reminds me of, this is how I judge whether or not someone's really a nerd. It's like, if you say, this is a segue, the different sci-fi shows you watch. Like if someone's like, yeah, I'm into Star Trek, Star Wars, I'm a nerd. I'm like, I'll ask them, have you watched Babylon 5, which was like a really crappy and amazing sci-fi show in the 90s. But in it, there's different alien races, and there was this alien race of the Centauri who used to be imperial. And now everyone kind of makes fun of them because they're in decline and refuse to accept it. It's kind of a little bit how people maybe talk about how Britain can be sometimes, but especially like the United States, where clearly our best days of glory are behind us, and we refuse to accept it. And to me, it equals a doubling down. Like I feel like the more we experience some sort of decline of infrastructure or prestige, the more we're going to see this. And to me, Trump is an example of this. Propaganda is kicking into overdrive. This "Make America Great Again."
Yeah.
Even though there's a tacit assumption that we've lost something, it's this thing because we alone have the special sauce that the world needs.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and, and people who've written about organizational lifespans, there's this sort of bell curve of an organization. And when it starts going downhill, you get to this phase. Some people have called it nostalgia. Some people, this sort of grasping to reestablish. You certainly see this in churches all the time, right? Like all these churches that are declining, like we got to go back to the 1950s and the way it was. And and it's that sense of, you're declining, and so the thing is, let's not go forward and figure out how to do things differently. It's let's go backward. And, you can't do that. Yeah.
A couple more. Ellen writes, and these next ones are about, I think, about individualism and economics again. Ellen writes, this was the problem with the old WWJD construct. What would Jesus do? You only ended up with the answer to the question, what do I think the best answer?
Right. What do I think?
What would I do here? Like, so there's this sense of, and this is part of it, and this is part of the myth structure of the United States, is we assume that this is why, if you're very conservative minded or libertarian, you don't think capitalism and individualism is bad for the whole. You actually tend to believe that if everyone is given as much freedom as possible to only look out for themselves, it gives as many people freedom to make their own lives better and not rely on anybody else. And so the common good is a lie that people tell you. That really what's the common good is everyone being able to look out for themselves and their own. Kathleen says, I believe, and this ties in, that capitalism is the religion of most Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Even if they don't believe it, like the way our lives are structured right now, the reason we can't respond to these sorts of crises well is because it's not economically beneficial for hospitals to have extra spaces to take in people during the pandemic.
Well, and and Kathleen, you're so right about that. We even see that in the church, right? I mean, along with this whole thing about how do churches do virtual worship services, I mean, it's amazing how forward the message has been of, and don't stop giving, and don't forget to come back to church and still be a member, right? I mean, that is just front and center in every single thing that I've seen. And, yesterday I was at a virtual meeting for Micah, and somebody said, well, why does every church have to design their own virtual worship service? Why don't we go to ones that are doing it well already? And of course, the reason for that is, well, because then we might lose membership and we might lose money, right? And so, yeah, I mean, that, I think there's no question about that's our national religion.
There's a couple more things, and then I'm realizing that I discovered something that just apparently we're sharing this thread on the CPI page, the Micah page, and the transmission page. And apparently, if people comment on any one of those, it doesn't show up all in one place. So,
oh my gosh!
So I don't understand why they do allow cross posting if you can't have cross listing of comments. Which I can next time I can kind of lay them all next to each other to see all what's going on. But
okay, so things. Sorry if we haven't seen your comments.
Sorry if we haven't seen your comments. We're figuring this out, and we don't know. Maybe we'll go back to the way we were doing it before. I don't know. Yeah, Stephen again writes, and Stephen is, just so people know, Stephen Richards, who's commenting, is from the UK, and so he said, this is exactly what happened in Britain. We lost the glory days, and people have tried to reclaim that through nationalism and Brexit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just exactly. Like the Centauri in Babylon 5. Watch it. Amy, my spouse, Amy, writes, comment from the transmission live broadcast from Connie. In the White House task force briefing, Trump was his usual exceptional America self today, plus he thinks we should open up the economy. This seems more important to him than people's lives. Yeah. And again, this is the twisted way that we start thinking about the common good. Right. That somehow the economy being robust serves the common good. And if people are willing to die, they're heroes in almost the same way that soldiers who are willing to die for democracy are heroes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so we're gonna have to close. And again, for those of you who haven't seen your comments because of our technological lack of exceptionalism, we're sorry, but thank you very much for watching. And I would really encourage you to try to find some news about some of the other ways that this is being dealt with in other countries, to try to contact your leaders and say, hey, look, there are other ways of doing this, and let's try to learn from other people. And that actually would be a really good thing. And then we can engage in our practice of humility, which is really helpful.
Yeah. And to start wondering, like, what would a just and good society look like? And do I dare hope for such a thing? Maybe I could close with some of these words from Oscar Romero.
That'd be great.
Again, we were also mentioned earlier in the broadcast that this is the 40th anniversary of the assassination/martyrdom of Saint Oscar Romero from El Salvador. And I will close with these words that are from his final mass. He's giving a homily right before he's executed, giving mass by U.S.-backed forces. You have heard Christ's gospel that one must not love oneself so much as to avoid getting involved in the risks of life, which history demands of us, that those who would avoid the danger will lose their life, while those who out of love for Christ give themselves to the service of others will live, like the grain of wheat that dies, but only apparently. If it did not die, it would not remain alone. The harvest comes about because it dies, allows itself to be sacrificed in the earth and destroyed. Only by destroying itself does it produce the harvest. You have heard Christ's gospel. We are warned that it profits one nothing to gain the whole world and lose oneself. Nevertheless, the expectation of a new earth must not weaken, but rather stimulate our concern for perfecting this earth, where the body of the new human family grows, a body that even now is able in some way to foreshadow that new age. And so, to the extent that temporal progress can contribute to the better ordering of human society, it is of serious concern for the kingdom of God, even though temporal progress must be carefully distinguished from the growth of Christ's kingdom. This is the hope that inspires us Christians. We know that every effort to better a society, especially one that is so enmeshed in injustice and in sin, is an effort that God blesses, that God desires, that God demands of us.
All right.
Amen.
So we'll see you all tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Thanks.